My Lords, this group of amendments is for many leaseholders the most important, and it differs from the rest of the bill. The rest of the bill gives rights to leaseholders which they didn't have when they bought their lease. This group restores rights which leaseholders thought they had when they bought the lease, but have now discovered that they didn't. And that right was to live in a building that complied with the safety regulations at the time. And these leaseholders took all the necessary precautions, employing professional people before buying, but now find they are faced with unaffordable bills, unsaleable properties, and quite often with repossession. As the Noble Earl referred to, the Sunday Times revealed that over 15,000 residents have been forced to leave homes due to fire and fire safety defects. And these decants are actually on the rise, with residents decanted from 21 buildings last year. Until these injustices are addressed, the bill with its new rights is meaningless to those leaseholders. Now, I welcome the steps the government has taken through the Building Safety Act, and I'm grateful to my noble friend, the Minister, for patiently listening to me during our many meetings. But despite the steps forward in recent years, there's still a gap between what the government promised at the outset and where we are now. I won't repeat the quotes I gave at second reading, but here is one I didn't use. Michael Gove on January the 10th, 2022. Most importantly, leaseholders are shouldering a desperately unfair burden. They are blameless, and it is morally wrong that they should be the ones asked to pay the price. End of quote. Now, I'll come back in a moment to those who fall outside the protection, but address Amendment 102 in the name of Lady Taylor asking for a progress report. This covers the same ground as my Amendment 101, which was down for Monday, but which I was unable to speak to owing to an aggressive COVID jab over the weekend. I'm grateful to Giles Grover and the team at End Our Cladding Scandal for their briefing. Now, according to the department's own figures on overall remediation, at the end of March this year, of the 4,329 buildings identified with unsafe cladding, over half have not started remediation, 7 years after Grenfell. Only 23%, 976, have completed remediation works. Within that overall figure, there are 1,501 buildings, 11 metres and over in height, which have life-critical fire safety defects, where developers have committed to remediate or pay to remediate, but over half have not started remediation. 1,001 of the developers' buildings have not even been assessed. And then looking at the cladding safety scheme, there are now 1,105 buildings within the scheme after the pilot was launched in November 2022. Work has been completed on not one. Work has started on two, and the rest are in various stages of which the largest is pre-application. Nor am I reassured by the statement by the department that I quote, all residential buildings above 11 metres in England have a pathway to fix unsafe cladding, either through a taxpayer-funded scheme or through a developer-funded scheme, protecting leaseholders from these costs. Having a pathway is like a traveller having a map. It doesn't follow that he has begun his journey. And where there is grant funding, the money is not being dispersed at pace. Because of these delays, the department had to surrender nearly £250 million to the Treasury last year. So we need a firm grip and oversight of remediation through the available schemes. And the available schemes have no visible oversight or coordination, and that is what Amendment 102 does. The rest of my amendments have broadly the same objective as Lord Lytton's, while getting there by a slightly different route. They would ensure the Building Safety Act operates as intended, as was the government's stated objective in the King's speech last year. On Amendment 96 on buildings under 11 metres, the department's view, as set out by Lee Rowley, the Minister, on April the 22nd was, I quote, "We can count on one hand where there has been a problem. We are working with each of those three buildings to make the progress we need to make." End of quotes. Those three require full remediation, but leaseholders are now reliant on the goodwill of their developer without any mechanism in place to compel work to take place to the necessary standard. And then in Inside Housing on April the 26th, it was reported that there are 586 homes under 11 metres in Barnet with defective cladding, where one owner, a 25% shared owner, has a bill of £23,000, and this falls outside the Building Safety Act. The other 75% is owned by a housing association, Notting Hill Genesis, but they have said, under the terms of the lease, the shared owner is responsible for all the remediation costs. Then mortgage lending on buildings under 11 metres is still inconsistent. Based on data from 4 to 5 mortgage lenders, an EWS1 certificate was deemed required for mortgage valuations on approximately 2,000 low-rise flats last year, although the government has said that's not necessary. Insurance in low-rise buildings is another quagmire, with several insurers mandating work as a requirement of providing cover. There are many cases of difficulties with insurance, and I quote only one. Aviva was the only insurer which would give cover on one low-rise block, but on condition that HPL cladding would be removed within an urgent time frame of 4 months. The judge at the first tier tribunal hearings was satisfied that that was the case, having seen the correspondence. There was no means of funding other than leaseholders. Cladding was removed in 2022 as instructed. It has taken 2 years to raise funds to replace the cladding, which will begin in February 2024. The total cost will be £45,000 per leaseholder. And then I remain concerned over resident-owned or enfranchised buildings, something Lord Lytton referred to, and that's covered by Amendment 99. Last November, the Department issued a press release which confirmed this bill would, I quote, include measures to amend the Building Safety Act 2022 to make it easier to ensure that those who caused building safety defects in enfranchised buildings are made to pay. 5 months later, it remains unclear as to what measures these will be, and those who were encouraged by the government to take ownership and control of their buildings remain beset with uncertainty on how and when their homes will be made safe, and they don't have the protection afforded to those who did not enfranchise. My Lords, the same press release also said the government would ensure, I quote, that the leaseholder protections are not unfairly weighted against those who own properties jointly. And this is addressed in Amendment 100. This is known as the marriage penalty, whereby a couple owning 4 properties together do not have this part ownership accounted for in the leadership protection, despite tax law recognising this pro rata weighting. A call for evidence on this was opened in early April. However, time seems to be running out for the government's commitments to be kept in respect of joint owner leaseholders, unless my noble friend can tell me otherwise. Then the Secretary of State has repeatedly expressed his desire to ensure that, I quote, those with the broadest shoulders must pay. So Amendment 100 also helps those who invested in buy-to-let, but whose shoulders are not broad. It ensures that all receive protection for the first 3 flats they own, rather than the current cliff edge. And it introduces a leaseholder wealth criteria, which is the same basis on which freeholders and developers are tested to assess whether they have the means to pay. The Department is well aware of the case of Malcolm in Salford, leaseholder of a number of properties with total value below £1 million, who asked the Department for help 2 years ago, but has now been forced to enter into bankruptcy. So who will now pay his share of the remediation costs? Finally, that amendment would end the distinction between qualifying and non-qualifying leases once prescribed conditions are met, once remediation is complete. And this would ensure that the value of flats owned by leaseholders who are still deemed to be non-qualifying would be returned to somewhere near their market value without the severe impairment that non-qualifying leases currently suffer, even where no work is required. So, my Lords, without this set of amendments, ordinary people across the country will still be shouldering a desperately unfair burden, still facing financial ruin, and still no closer to being able to move on with their lives, all at odds with assurances that ministers have given. I know my noble friend is sympathetic, and I look forward to her reply.
I support the amendments in the name of the noble Lord Rooker of Cookham. My right reverend friend, the Bishop of Manchester, has put his name to these amendments and regrets that he cannot be in his place today. As we've heard, the Building Safety Act of 2022 contained welcome measures to address historic building safety defects. But the fact remains, as other noble lords have noted, that it does not go nearly far enough. 7 years on from the Grenfell fire, only 21% of high-rise blocks have been fully remediated. And they are the ones that are eligible. There remain gaps in provision where leaseholders are disqualified for such arbitrary reasons as their block being 10.9 metres tall rather than, say, 11.1. The Act disqualifies huge numbers of people who are now trapped in potentially unsafe flats which they will struggle to sell. They might face very high bills, as we've heard, through service charges and insurance premiums. My Right Reverend friend's Diocese of Manchester has been identified, as already mentioned by Lord Young, as one of the most at-risk areas for inadequate cladding. Over 20 buildings have been identified with ACM cladding in both Manchester and Salford. And in Salford, between 6 and 10 of those are yet to be remediated. The measures are not being implemented fast enough, which is why I also support the amendment from Baroness Pinnock, which would require a statement to Parliament on progress, because clearly more scrutiny is needed. But for those buildings which are ineligible for support entirely, a statement to Parliament does not go anywhere near far enough. Could I ask the noble Baroness, the Minister, to tell the House whether she believes that living on the top floor of a block of 11.5 metres is significantly safer than living on the top floor of a block of 11 metres, where both have flammable cladding? Beyond this obvious safety issue, my Right Reverend friend has received correspondence evidencing the difficulties which some leaseholders face in selling ineligible properties due to the difficulties in obtaining a mortgage on these flats. Will the noble Baroness, the Minister, commit to ending this injustice once and for all today?
All the amendments in this group relate to building safety, and it has to be said, from the fallout of the Building Safety Bill and the gaps that have been created as a result of it, which the noble lords have outlined very well, and I'm certain Baroness Taylor will do too. After the tragic events of the Grenfell Tower in 2017, in which 72 people lost their lives, it became clear that millions of leaseholders would need to make their buildings safe and habitable. The campaign group End Our Cladding Scandal, some of which are here today, estimates that as many as 3 million leaseholders are caught up in the scandal. That's a huge amount of families and people. And if you actually think of people they know and care for and love, you're actually talking about considerably more than that. The Building Safety Act sought to protect leaseholders from cost of remediating their safety defects, but as has been amplified, the scheme has a glaring issue. A huge number of affecting leaseholders are not included, and we support the amendments that are clearly designed to widen that pool, if not just say, let's do the whole caboodle. Estimates included in a briefing from a national registered landlord suggest that there are approximately 1.3 million leaseholders of buildings less than 11 metres in height who are not able to qualify for support. This in addition to the 400,000 leaseholders of high-rise buildings who are non-qualifying due to other eligibility criteria, such as has been mentioned, the franchise leaseholders and leaseholders owning more than 3 flats. On learning about that a little bit more, it seems to me that this is a travesty. And as has been stated by others, these leaseholders are facing eye-watering sums. And many are living in unsafe buildings that are unmortgageable, uninsurable, unsellable, and that they have been abandoned is unconscionable. Amendments 93B, 96, 97, 99, 100, 105 and 107 seek in different ways to expand the number of leaseholders eligible for remediation support. This is the right thing to do. But, my Lords, it is also obvious that there are some small adjustments that can be made to make things better for more. Simply, for example, looking at the wealth, or what it's known as the affordability test, or the issues of joint ownership. 93B in particular, tabled by the noble Lord Lytton, is very clear that only a building remuneration scheme will ensure that all buildings with safety defects undergo remediation, irrespective of ownership or building height. And that is what we would agree with. Too many people are falling through the gaps that have emerged post the Building Safety Act. Insurance has already been mentioned as one, so I won't make any more comments on that. It seems to us, however, that the pragmatic amendments 96, 97, 99 and 100 from Lord Young of Cookham are arguably the neatest way of achieving this aim. They simply amend the Building Safety Act so that these non-qualifying leaseholders are included in support that is available to other leaseholders. And I move Amendment 102 in the name of Baroness Pinnock, which would require the government to report on progress relating to the building safety remediation. And I'm sure she would probably agree with the comments made by the noble prelate. This particular amendment was drafted in response to concerns raised by the End Our Cladding Scandal, namely the speed at which remediation is occurring, alongside the progress in ensuring leaseholders actually have access to a robust and independent dispute resolution process, and the fact that not all affected leaseholders are able to access protection. The government, I note, does publish monthly figures relating to the remediation of building safety defects, but there is no clear target for when these works should be completed. It would be appreciated if the Minister could perhaps clarify this, and I'm minded of the phrase that you don't fatten a pig by simply weighing it. My Lords, to us, the speed and lack of a plan or any sense of urgency is clearly the impetus behind Earl Lytton's amendments. It seems no one is holding everyone's feet to the fire. The government also promised a robust and independent resolution process that would allow leaseholders to challenge building assessments or remediation. This has arguably not come to pass, with the process being more ad hoc and without sufficient leaseholder representation. It is vital that leaseholders are able to hold developers to account and ensure that remediation is completed safely, in a timely manner and at good value, but they need more government clout. Something that has only mentioned briefly that I'd like to expand on a little bit. It seems to me that, that developers are getting all the flack. We all agree that leaseholders are blameless, but developers are not the only party to blame, and many others still need to be brought to the table, preferably with cash, to provide that funding that will fix the problem. And I'm talking about product manufacturers, architects and designers, contractors, building control, testing houses, insurers. They all have a part to play, and they should all play their part. And I suspect that when the Grenfell inquiry reports later this year, the role that successive governments, to be fair, have played will also be unavoidable. We feel it's time that the government really stepped up and gripped this problem comprehensively. They are the ringmaster, after all. Yes, of course, sir.
I'm most grateful to her for giving way. She mentioned there a list of people who had a degree of responsibility, and one of them, of course, is building control. And it seems to me that my experience of building control, local authorities, they can be extremely pernickety, they can be very difficult, they can be enforce very high standards So all of us in our different cities will have seen examples of absolutely grotesque omissions and failures. But is it not the case that a local authority has a statutory liability through our building control, and that in and of itself could be a source and should be a source of remedy for a person who finds themselves in this position? But on top of that, is there not an incentive for a developer having built a structure, sold on the units, to actually wind up and move on to a different company to build the next one? So we end up with people slipping out of the net entirely.
On a point, that in some estates, you build one building that might just meet the requirements, and then more are built, and it's completely expanded the problem. And I agree with a lot of what is said. What I was trying to point out is that we are tending to say it's all on the developers, where actually I think this is a systemic failure of quite a series of accountable people. It is simply what I'm trying to say. And ultimately what I am saying is that, sadly, for democracy, this is yet another state failure, like Waspy, blood contamination, Windrush, to name but a few. But the harsh reality is that the impact of this is felt every day by some people, and is growing when a leaseholder decides that they want to reinsure, or somebody decides they want to sell, and suddenly, wow, I didn't realise that there was all this. So therefore the number of people is actually growing. I'm going to end on what Baroness Pinnock always says: leaseholders have done nothing wrong and everything right. Excellent campaigning from groups like End Our Cladding Scandal and the Non-Qualifying Leaseholders Group has helped us achieve the progress we have made on remediation support. We owe it to them to keep pressing the government on making sure that all leaseholders are protected from the costs of a situation they did absolutely nothing to cause.
Clear from the number of building safety amendments in this group, in this bill, and previously in the Levelling Up bill, what appears from our debates to be a cross-party consensus from most of us, except the government front bench, that there is such deep dissatisfaction with building safety in general, and with the glacial progress on remediation in particular. This was carefully calculated in that recent Times article referred to earlier, the article by Martina Lees, to show that only 8% of buildings in need have been remedied, not the 21% that the government claim, and which was mentioned by the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Lincoln. As important are the huge numbers of non-qualifying leaseholders whose dreams of property ownership have turned to nightmares as the horror of their uncertain financial position, the escalating costs of remediation, and the impossibility of selling homes, which, and I've seen evidence of this, valuers are currently placing at zero or even negative value, snatch away their aspirations and leave behind only extreme anxiety. Numbers vary, but the Times estimate the numbers of homes affected are up to 1.5 million, and as other noble lords have said, upwards of 4 million people affected. An excellent briefing from the National Resident Landlords Association points to the fact that data remains lacking, and gives the estimate there are approximately 1.3 million leaseholders of buildings less than 11 metres in height, along with the 400,000 leaseholders referred to by the noble Baroness Thornhill of high-rise buildings who are non-qualifying due to other eligibility criteria. Many leaseholders are unaware of their non-qualifying status, or are only alerted when they receive an invoice for remediation works or they attempt to sell their property. And of course, my lords, it's important to remember that many leaseholders, understandably, are reluctant to speak out on this issue for fear of further devaluing their what they thought was going to be a very valuable property asset. So the scale of this problem is eye-watering, and I agree with comments made previously by members of your Lordship's House, unless this is addressed urgently, as more and more leaseholders discover their liability, another enormous injustice scandal will unravel, which will scar whole generations of homeowners. The Noble Earl Lytton has referred to the fact that this will escalate over time to the detriment of freeholders and leaseholders, but with the balance of personal financial risk sitting with the leaseholders. The system the government put in place, and which was subject to an update to your Lordship's House at the end of March, may have made some progress, but as a spokesperson for Grenfell United has said, government's shockingly slow progress towards remediation shows a complete lack of political will to keep people safe in their own homes. And Giles Grover of the excellent group End Our Cladding Scandal says the majority of unsafe buildings across the country still don't have plans in place to fix all the issues. For the 7,283 mid-rise buildings that the government has estimated to be unsafe, these are just missing from any plan for remediation as they are deemed non-qualifying, and the unbearable pressure of remediation falling on the ordinary people who make these flats their homes. While the government has brought forward pieces of legislation and statutory instruments to deal with this situation, progress has been slow because issues are being dealt with by acting piecemeal as they arise. And even when legislation has been considered, like the Building Safety Act 2022, which should have been a comprehensive solution, too often proposed amendments were rejected, with serious impacts and consequences for leaseholders only now becoming more apparent. The Noble Earl Lytton proposes a very comprehensive and detailed framework to encompass the whole situation around building safety remediation, and which would give more structure to the current piecemeal approach. While I understand the level of detail he proposes in this scheme will almost certainly be greeted with, not be greeted with a wholehearted approval that in all honesty it probably deserves by the Noble Baroness, the Minister, I do hope that both the principle of having such a framework in place and the thorough approach set out by the Noble Earl will at least be a matter for reflection and future consideration as the bill progresses. Amendments 96 and 97 from the Noble Lord Young of Cookham and his amendments 99 and 100, to which I've added my name, as well as amendments of 105E and 105F from the Noble Earl Lytton, are all aimed at ending the iniquitous distinction between qualifying and non-qualifying leaseholders. My Lord, surely we cannot simply allow the nightmare many non-qualifying leaseholders are enduring to continue. We totally support the aim of Amendment 102 in the name of the Noble Baroness Lady Pinnock in terms of holding the government to account for the building safety remediation programme. The reporting mechanism so far does not appear to have accelerated the progress on remediation, although it has to be said that the bringing to justice of some of the worst developer offenders, like those involved with Vista Tower in Stevenage, is welcome. I hope the government will accept this amendment and bring regular updates before your Lordship's House, but it would be even better if these could have target dates for outstanding work to be completed. The fact this remediation has dragged on for so many years is a cause of great frustration, anxiety and financial hardship to those affected. So can I ask the Noble Baroness, the Minister, if the government have a view about and a projected end date for these works to be completed? A deadline, even if it is not met by absolutely everyone involved, is great for concentrating the minds of those who are involved in remediation. And can I just point out, in response to the points made by the Noble Baroness Thornhill and the Noble Lord MP, I agree with what the Noble Baroness Thornhill said. There is more than just developers responsible for this issue. But one of the big problems here was the deregulation of the building control function, taking it away from local authorities and allowing developers to pick and choose who their building control inspectors would be, has been greatly responsible for some of these issues. Our Amendment 105 is quite simple and straightforward in its aim, and I move that amendment now, which is to bring the beleaguered and non-qualified leaseholders in desperate need of remedies for their building defects within the remit of the Building Safety Act 2022. Surely, if we are all concerned about ensuring that people feel safe and are safe in their homes, we can all support this, and it remains our position that it should not be the responsibility of leaseholders to suffer the financial consequences of defective building. Amendment 105C from the Noble Earl Lytton has a similar aim. And can I also support my noble friend Lord Rooker in his campaign to highlight the danger of, I was going to call them electricity surges, but I better not now because I'll get in trouble with him, neutral current diversion. I want to come back, my lords, to the case quoted by Martina Lees, that of Viv Sharma and his Ukrainian wife Julia, who had to leave their 9-storey block when the fire service deemed it unsafe, with more than 17 defects caused by the original developers, which should never have been approved by building control. They've been offered less for their property than they bought it for 15 years ago. They have had to pay for temporary accommodation. As Julia says, I am 50 now, how am I supposed to rebuild my life? This situation, morally wrong, as the Noble Lord Young says, remains in place. These situations should have been remedied by the Building Safety Act. They were not. We now have another opportunity to put things right. So I hope the government will do so and accept the amendments before us today.
I want to start by thanking you for the amendments on building safety, but also for the thoughtful debate. It is a really important issue, and I will take all the amendments in turn and put the government's view. Firstly, I thank the Noble Lord, the Earl of Lytton, for the amendments 93B and 107. My Lords, the aims of these amendments were debated extensively during the passage of the Building Safety Act 2022 and the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2023, and I thank the Noble Lord for his years of important campaigning on building safety, but putting forward these amendments again and speaking to them in such a detailed way as ever, my Lords. We continue to consider his arguments and are always willing to listen, of course we are, and carefully to the ways in which we can improve the current regime. That is why the government tables several clauses in the other place to clarify and extend the protections in some particular areas of this Act. However, I want to reiterate that implementing a new building safety remediation scheme would reverse what has been achieved by the regulatory regime set out in the Building Safety Act. Creating a system which mirrors the existing regime would delay essential remediation already being carried out. It would also create uncertainty for leaseholders across the country, my Lords. The responsible actor scheme, the developer remediation contract, remediation orders and remediation contribution orders are already delivering many of the Noble Lord's objectives, requiring developers to fix problems, my Lords, that they have caused. The Earl of Lytton asked me what would happen to buildings that need remediation, but the landlord goes into insolvency. An application for a remediation contribution order can be made by an interesting party under Section 124 of the Building Safety Act to recover cost or contribution costs of remediation from a past landlord, a developer, or a person associated with those entities, including a person associated with the current landlord. It follows that a leaseholder or other interested person would be entitled to apply for a remediation contribution order even if the current landlord was insolvent. As any proceedings would not be against the current landlord, the insolvency of the landlord does not preclude this course of action, my Lords. And if an application for an order is successful, the tribunal has the power to order that payment is made directly to a specified person. Yeah.
On that matter, am I understanding that if a company was responsible for defective property and that company became insolvent, would the directors of that company be capable of then recommencing and building another property, or are you saying that the individuals could be followed through the courts for remediation rather than being able to sidestep their responsibilities?
My Lord,
think that's an interesting point and a very legal point, and I would rather, I think, than speaking off the top of my head, get it right and write to the noble lord. Thank you. I now want to move to Amendment 96, 97, 99 and 100, and I thank my noble friend, the Lord Young of Cookham, for these amendments. Amendment 96 and 99 would extend the leaseholder protections to both buildings under 11 metres and to collectively owned leaseholder buildings. It is generally accepted that the risk of life from historic fire safety defects is proportionate to the height of buildings. As this risk is lower in buildings under 11 metres, such buildings will only require remediation in very exceptional circumstances, my lord. And given the small number of buildings, and that is 3 across the country that have required this, 2 of them the developers have remediated. The 3rd one, we are in negotiations to get that remediation done. Our assessment remains that extending the leaseholder protections to these buildings is neither necessary, my lords, nor proportionate. Where leaseholders in under 11 metres are facing remediation costs, they should contact, and I've said this so many times at the dispatch box, it is important that they contact the department immediately, and we will look into that individual building on a case-by-case basis, my lords. And if necessary, we will write to the building owner to seek assurances that any proposed works are necessary, they're proportionate, and that the rights to redress are being fully utilised. The government understands that some leaseholders in these buildings are still facing higher insurance premiums, with insurers citing building safety as the reason for the increase. The Association of British Insurers and their members have stated premiums should reduce where buildings comply with building regulations, and we expect insurers to honour their commitments and make sure that premiums are priced fairly and appropriate to the level of risk. Regarding collectively owned leasehold buildings, the government made the decision that the leaseholder protections in the Building Safety Act would not apply to these buildings. As a result, they would still have to pay to remedy the safety defects in their building as owners. Residents who own the freehold would not only have to pay for their portion of remediation costs, but also for any residents who did not participate in the purchase of the freehold, my lord. Since the Building Safety Act, though, the government has continued to examine the situation faced by collectively owned leaseholder buildings. And for instance, the Building Safety Leaseholder Protections England Regulations 2022 provide owners in these leaseholder-owned buildings with the access to remediation contribution costs. We've listened, my lords, and we've acted. Turning now to Amendment 97, the existing leaseholder protection packages is designed to maintain a fine balance between leaseholders' and freeholders' rights. The proposed amendment distorts, in our view, the balance disproportionately in favour of leaseholders and risks unfairly benefiting one group of investors, leaseholders, to the detriment of another, the freeholders. Regarding Amendment 100, our intention has always been to protect individuals living in their own homes rather than those who have purchased property for financial or commercial reasons. Changing the leaseholder protection regime so it is linked to a share of ownership rather than individual properties will also introduce an unnecessary level of uncertainty and complexity into the protections. Regarding cessation certificates, it is not clear what effect such a certificate would have or how a landlord would know when to serve one. The responsibility for the costs of fixing historical building safety defects should rest with those responsible for creating them, my lords. The Building Safety Act was clear that when this is not possible, that responsibility for remediation should be shared between stakeholders in the property. Concentrating responsibility on a single group would risk a number of unintended consequences, including freeholders becoming insolvent. Taken together, the changes made by this amendment would therefore complicate the regime unnecessary and slow the progress made towards remediation of buildings. I thank the noble Baroness, Baroness Thornhill on behalf of Baroness Pinnock for the Amendment 102 on the reporting requirement for the building safety remediation. The government is committed to accelerating remediation and protecting affected residents. The total number of buildings reported to have started or completed remediation works in England has more than doubled since the end of March 2023. Along with monthly updates, ministers have also committed to providing the other place and those interested with regular updates of progress, and the latest of which was provided on the 26th of March, my lords. I'm going to bring in Lord Young. Cookham asked a question on ACM cladding at this point, and just to say, as another noble lord mentioned, pathways, and I realise that pathways don't mean delivery, but all residential buildings, I think importantly, above 11 metres in England, have a pathway to fixing unsafe cladding, either through taxpayer-funded schemes, developer-funded schemes, or social housing provider-led remediation, protecting leaseholders from these costs, my lords. 99% of high-rise buildings with unsafe Grenville-style ACM cladding identified before 2023 have been made safe or have work underway to make them safe. The proportion of buildings remediated continues to shift as more buildings are being identified. And 90% of all high-rise buildings with ACM cladding have been made safe or have work underway. My noble friend Lord Young also brought up the issue of decanting, and the government did amend this bill in the other place to make it explicit that the costs of alternative accommodation for residents when they are decanted from their homes to avoid imminent threat of life or of personal injury, or because of remediation costs, works cannot take place whilst residents are in the occupation. They can recover those costs through a remediation contribution order, and I think that's an important change to this bill, my lords. The department continues to take steps to support applicants to start on site quicker, as well as local authorities, fire and rescue authorities, and health and safety executives. That can take enforcement actions against those not progressing remedial works where building owners are failing to, or where building owners are failing to make acceptable progress, and those responsible should expect further action to be taken if they're not doing that, my lords. 55 of the largest developers signed legally binding contracts committing to remediate or pay to remediate life-critical fire safety defects in 1,500 buildings over 11 metres that have had a role in developing in England over the 30 years to April 2022. And together with the Building Safety Levy, this will see industry contribute an estimated £6 billion and the department publishes developer progress based on quarterly returns submitted by developers, and those are available. I want to be clear that the introduction of new reporting requirements involves time and cost, which needs to be balanced against the need to continue our progress in building remediation, my lords. So I would ask the noble Baroness to withdraw her amendment. Next, I want to thank the noble lady Baroness Taylor of Stevenage for her amendment 105. Similar to Amendment 97, this amendment would open the door to changes which distort that balance disproportionately in favour of one group to the detriment of another. It is important that legislation provides clarity for leaseholders, for freeholders, and for the courts. The government believes that having definitions of qualifying and non-qualifying leases in primary legislation provides greater certainty to all interested parties, an important consideration given this is a pivotal part of the legislation for so many people across the country. Next, I thank the noble Lord the Earl of Lytton for amendments 105C to 105G, which seek to make several changes to the building safety regime and, in the case of 105G, to the insolvency regime. Amendment 105C would rewrite the developer remediation contract by statute. This would unfortunately serve to create operational legal confusion about what developers' obligations are, which buildings need to be identified and remediated, and to what standards, resulting in delay and litigation. I hope the House would agree that the government should instead focus on holding developers to account for the remediating unsafe buildings as quickly as possible. Regarding Amendment 105D, it is right that the government has worked with major developers who built defective buildings to secure binding commitments to remediate worth an estimated £3 billion. However, I do not believe that it would be fair to also target these specific developers to pay a disproportionate share of other remediation costs for buildings that they have no connection with. That is why we're focused on setting up the Building Safety Levy to contribute funds to our programmes to remediate buildings over 11 metres, and the levy is estimated to raise a further £3 billion over 10 years or more. Turning now to Amendment 105E, we've had much debate on the merits, I think, of this amendment in my views on Amendments 96, 97 and 99. As I mentioned earlier, there are relatively small numbers of residential buildings under 11 metres or 5 stories that require remediation. These buildings are considered to be at low risk of historical fire defects, and I maintain that this change would disproportionately and unfairly place the obligation for remediation of non-life-threatening defects on freeholders. Meanwhile, extending protection to leaseholders who have not purchased freehold would place the financial burden of remediation entirely on those leaseholders who own a share of the freehold for the cost of remediation, making it less likely that these buildings will be remediated. As for providing leaseholder protections to leaseholders who own more than 3 dwellings, I reiterate the points raised earlier. Landlords owning a number of properties are like to have these as investments, and a fair balance needs to be made. The Building Safety Act was not designed to benefit investors. It is to help individuals living in their own homes. Turning to Amendment 105F, removing qualifications for passing on costs for defects in service charges would widen the scope of the leaseholder protections considerably. This would risk the burden of remediation costs falling disproportionately on landlords, whether or not those landlords are also some or all of the leaseholders in the buildings. The amendment also provides for members of a building industry scheme to cover remediation costs, and I've already mentioned my concerns with a similar approach in Amendment 105D. The disclaimer could mean that leaseholders... I think I've missed one, have I? Beg your pardon, I think I've missed one. Yes, I have. Finally, turning to Amendment 105G. Remediation projects are complex construction projects which can take years of from the beginning to the end. Taking on some such projects may not be consistent with the role of an insolvency practitioner or receiver in a particular case, and may conflict with the existing statutory duties under the insolvency law. Additionally, if there were no funds available to the office holder, which will make an application to the court for a remediation contribution order, they will be faced with a legal duty that they cannot meet. If such a duty is imposed, it will create a risk that it will prove possible to appoint such office holders where the duty will arise, as they will be unwilling to consent to that role. This will interfere with the operation of the insolvency regime and may make compulsory liquidation an eventual disclaimer by an official receiver acting as a liquidator more likely, my lords. Disclaimers